why Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not as tough as wrestling, and chances are it never will be unless it really transforms into a professional martial art.
I'm a 33-year veteran of the martial arts and a BJJ black belt, and I'm going to put some perspective on things. Wrestlers have an advantage in all combat sports based on the fact that wrestlers train in a very small but intense talent pool. Let me explain. A martial arts program is always a business because they have to rent space to hold classes, and the instructor has to make some sort of money to cover bills. Given that dynamic, they have to accept a wide range of students based on their ability to pay and not on their talent. Some will be very tough, others not so much. The fact that bills have to be paid, the martial arts program does not have the luxury to turn away paying students because they would water down the talent pool. Contrast this with a wrestling program at a middle or high school. They don't have to pay rent, and they can select just the 10 to 20 toughest guys to be on the team. Given the dynamic that there are limited spots that people are trying out for, the training can be more and more demanding. If one doesn't like to train hard, they are cut. The weaker people get culled from the team in this situation, so those that remain push each other. As St. Paul says, iron sharpens iron just as one man strengthens another. At a martial arts school, sparring is always a mix of weak and tough. At a wrestling program, it is 100% grueling all the time. If a BJJ program had the luxury of only having the 10 to 20 best students come to training every day, that team would be unstoppable. We saw this with the Danaher Death Squad. It was a small team pulled from the larger student body at the academy of people who trained daily amongst the best the school had to offer. The difference is that most state schools have a wrestling program, but a tiny fraction of martial arts schools can have a Danaher Death Squad situation.
This is something I never really thought of before, and the entire comment was honestly really insightful. Especially once you take it to the college level, it's selecting from a selection of the guys who were already a minority of the population. Not to mention that a lot of people who wrestle start when they're young, and if you start around that middle school age, you really have a unique opportunity to ingrain good habits, controlling, taking people down, wrestling instincts that overall you can do all those moves in jiu-jitsu and for the most part are very effective. You can ingrain that in your muscle memory, and so as you get older, your body is built for grappling in a way that honestly the average jiu-jitsu player probably starts in their late 20s, maybe early 30s. Some guys start when they're 40, even 50. Every single person who comes up through middle school wrestling basically gets the opportunity to grapple for their entire lives. And not only that, they're grappling in a selected pool. Because let's take my high school, for example. I had a graduating class of about 900 kids. Of that, the middle schools were much smaller because eventually they all combined into the one high school. Even in the middle school, let's say there are 200 kids in a graduating class. That means you can pick the toughest 20 people of those 200 kids that are willing to try out for wrestling. You can start teaching them drills. You can start having them actually grappling each other, which will build those muscles over time. And then you move on to the high school. It's a smaller selection because not everyone who comes up through middle school continues through high school. There are some new kids, but for the most part, you get a big group of these kids that come up, and now they're selected in the high school. And the toughest high schoolers, even if you start in high school, you still have that opportunity, especially if you start as a freshman and you really get into it. By the time you're a sophomore in high school wrestling, if you stuck with it all that way, you'll be very tough. Especially those middle schoolers who come up through it and you start competing in tournaments, you're used to that competition aspect because when you're wrestling, you're competing like every weekend or every other weekend. And then you have to compete within the team in order to get spots, in order to, wrestle off, so the better wrestler goes and ends up competing for that weekend. Some of those people will have competitive wins, and usually the higher of those people, those talent pools, will get a scholarship for wrestling. And if you get a scholarship to go wrestle, you are one of the very, very small percentage of the population who's been wrestling probably their entire life, who has been wrestling and grappling with some of the most elite types of individuals their entire life, because it's a small subset of the population where this comment goes into detail about most jiu-jitsu gyms are always going to have a mix of those regular average Joes, and maybe a small subset of the population, comes every day and is super competitive. And that's why very few schools are large enough to have a Danaher Death Squad where there's like 10 or so students who can become that elite grappling pool. And so by the time you make it up through college, you are a small elite group of middle schoolers, which, you know, for middle school, it's still pretty tough. A small elite group of high schoolers, and then of that elite group of high schoolers, out of the whole state or even country, a small subset of them are handpicked by colleges to come up and wrestle with a scholarship. Now, some guys wrestle without a scholarship, but even still, they have to compete and really, really make it to those, you know, super high levels. Then, if you get into Division One, you're in another league of just entirely other human. So people who come up through that are going to be in a much more elite pool than the average person who starts martial arts. If you're lucky enough to start in your teenage years at all in martial arts, you have a very unique opportunity to develop your body in such a way that it gets used to grappling. Unfortunately, there are some people who start when they're older in jiu-jitsu, and they're going to have things that don't necessarily move the way they used to. I started when I was 17, so I just barely made it in that period where I could get much more used to grappling, and I trained a lot. So I barely got in at the tail end of my development, and I kind of burned it into my system. I'm still not as conditioned for jiu-jitsu as someone who started when they were young. Take the Rotolo brothers, for example. They have a different kind of conditioning than I do. I'm much more in shape for jiu-jitsu than the average individual, but I'm not as flexible as the Rotolo brothers. Obviously, they're elite of the elite in jiu-jitsu, and they're top #1 people for a reason, but I've known some people who started when they were younger as kids, came up through the kids belt system, and they have years of experience, especially if they wrestled a little bit in that time. Just lots and lots of grappling experience, lots and lots of knowledge that adds up. But like this comment pointed out, it's a different level of experience when you're going in an elite pool versus the average jiu-jitsu gym, which has a mix of good and bad people. Now, certain jiu-jitsu gyms are going to be a little bit more elite than others. Certain gyms are going to focus more on competing than others, especially those that have MMA programs. Usually they're a little bit tougher. Some larger gyms are just going to have a large enough pool to where there are a handful of elite people, but the majority of the population is regular everyday people who were not selected at random for being the toughest, being willing to put in the extra work. You know, because there's conditioning that comes along with wrestling. There's weightlifting. There's all this other stuff versus the average gym where you got to deal with regular people and make a living. And that's not to say that's a bad thing. It's just, it's different and more elite on the wrestling side, which is why they have such an advantage over almost all martial artists. Thank you for leaving this comment. I hope the video did this justice.